Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Claims that the highest societal value any nation can espouse is freedom. Freedom, he argues, encompasses the other virtues like abundance, humor, courage, mercy. Human dignity is nothing without freedom. Such freedom must include selflessness, agape love, we say here at church, and a faith that never gives up. Freedom values truthfulness and equal justice under the law. No one will be free until we live peacefully as equals. Today's gospel lesson offers a deep understanding of freedom, how God's brand of freedom calls the people to reconcile and live together with respect. Did you notice how at first Jesus impressed everybody with his hometown performance arts sermon? How often have I wanted to get up in front of everybody and just read a killer passage of scripture like Jesus did, Isaiah 61, can't beat it, and then mic drop. Deal with it, people. You heard the Bible. That's some gangster preaching. By reading from Isaiah 61, Jesus comes out as God's advocate for the outsider, the poor, the disabled, women, the oppressed, and the incarcerated. The congregation was very impressed with his reading. Hometown boy does good. Jesus laughs it off, telling them they will eventually find something to object to. They loved me over in Capernaum, but prophets are never accepted in their own hometowns. And to make his point, he keeps on preaching. You can tell that's his first sermon because we never know when to stop. Not a good idea. Stop when you're finished. Land the plane, we like to say. Do not circle looking for a landing strip. Land the plane. And he was preaching from a seat in the congregation amongst the people. I think that's an important symbolic location. The word matters more out here in the people, out there in the public. What happened to turn the crowd on Jesus? Sam Candler writes, well, what happened was this. Jesus declared quite plainly his mission would go far beyond the comfortable confines of Nazareth, and even far beyond the Hebrew tradition. Jesus hinted at he did not belong to Nazareth. He did not belong to his parents. He did not even belong to the synagogue. Jesus recounted two challenging biblical examples. Example one, there was a great famine in the days of Elijah, leaving countless widows in Israel home. But God sent Elijah to a widow in Sidon. That's not Israel. That's outside of Israel. That's a foreign land. Example two, while there were plenty of lepers in Israel, Elisha was sent instead to somebody in Syria. Syria is not the chosen people. God's mercy extends outside the family, over the border, out on the margins, to people who don't look like us, or act like us, or want to be us. God's love is too big for tribalism. God's love is too big for nationalism. The congregation's boundary defenders crossed their arms and sucked their teeth and glared at Jesus. Can you imagine the talk at coffee hour? Well, Lordy, how about that? I remember back when Joseph brought him home with that girl from Egypt. What begins with an M? Doesn't matter. Anyway, whoever thought he'd come back so, I don't know, reprogrammed? Well, he's a little uppity if you ask me. He says that he's just back from some hippy-dippy retreat out in the wilderness where he fasted for 40 days and came to grips with his demons, whatever that means. Why would he choose that scripture anyway? Good news for the poor, prisoners running free. And then there's that last verse about the year of the Lord's favor. You know that means debt forgiveness, don't you? That's not fair. I paid off my loans. He sounds a little woke, if you ask me. Calvary's most amazing communications director, Jess Churchill, who's standing in the back, now I'm embarrassing her, yes, recently pointed out to me something that I should have seen a long time ago. DEI, which we know stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, when just as a word, is also the Latin term for God. Dei, as in deity, or imago Dei, our foundational belief that we're all created in the image of God and that we're all equally imprinted with divinity from God. Human beings, children of God without exception. In 2025, it's hard to name a moral virtue that does not sound woke. That is problematic. The dominant billionaires and their algorithms are just fine with wrong and right trading places. Fact-checking, why bother? Sticking up for the outcast will always upset the right people. When Jesus spoke truth to this depravity, the people tried to hurl him off a cliff. Did you know at the time of his assassination, Dr. King was the most hated man in this nation? To borrow Isaiah's words, he was despised. He was rejected. Stanford philosopher Rene Girard argues that every story about Jesus hinges on reconciliation. Every time Gerard identifies a scapegoat or an outcast, a powerless person, a straw man, somebody to blame, Jesus restores that character in the story to a better life. Jesus heals them. He restores their vision. He allows them to walk again. He feeds them. He saves them from death. He brings home the lost. Reconciliation is what clears the path for freedom. Nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of northwest Georgia lies my hometown, Plainville. The name is descriptive, Plainville. Population 310. Plainville is further north and smaller than Plains. It is, It's home to at least 8 churches, most of them some variation of Southern Baptist, but the Floyd family, thank you very much, attended the United Methodist Church with the sophisticated hillbillies. So travel with me back in time to the early 1970s. I'm about 8 or 9 years old. I'm 60 now. My parents are in their late 30s back then. My mother drives a Ford Galaxy. My father an Oldsmobile, the company car. It's a Sunday afternoon. That morning during worship, the Methodist preacher, Parson Lash, from upstate New York, had informed us that the AME church, that is the black church, was invited to worship with us at a special revival service that very evening. That was the process. Yeah. Although no one drove Parson Lash out to a cliff for his hurling, they certainly wanted to. Everybody called my mother that afternoon. At one point, she got so tired of listening, she laid the receiver down on the counter and walked off. When she returned, they hadn't even noticed. People were just ginned up. So are y'all going tonight? Because we are, okay? She told them. Okay, then we'll tell you all about it. Yeah, I hope Miss Waters comes too. We love her. Yes, bye now. Okay, so Miss Waters was the babysitter for everybody. She was a big cinnamon-colored woman. I loved her. Everybody loved her. And now in my older age, I realize I didn't know much about her, and that's a shame. What I did know is if she brought food to share, we had better beat my father to it. My mother, Barbara, and her friend Annie Ruth agreed to dress up that night as a sign of welcome. Now, Barbara, that's how she talked, Barbara, the colored people dress up for church more than we do. Do not wear those pants you wore this morning. This is a story from it's dated language from a past era. The 1900s. Thanks, Joanne. When we got to church, there was a small crowd already gathering outside on the front lawn near the front door of the church. At the foot of the red brick steps, the pastor from the AME led his congregation to kneel in silence. And then he prayed that God might make them worthy to enter this white man's church. Some of the women cried and prayed for God to forgive them for violating this mysterious, off-limits, sacred place. I would not understand what had happened until much later, but something in 8-year-old me knew to remember, to pay attention. I don't remember one word from that service, but I remember that afterwards in the car, my mother railed. Who told them that? Why do they think that? Do they really think that? Because of her own growing up problems, she had never been conditioned to examine things. My parents lived a pretty much unexamined life. The local school curriculum was controlled by people who chose to exclude challenging histories like slavery and Jim Crow. And as I've said before, I didn't know the Trail of Tears started in my hometown until I was 30. In the meantime, the descendants of slaves had been conditioned to accept the lies of racism. Justice delayed is more than justice denied. It's psycho-spiritual abuse. While the dominant society puts off doing what we know is right, the scapegoats of society begin to think, maybe I do deserve it. Maybe I am a mistake. Maybe I am indeed a defective pariah. How has society taught you to fear yourself, to accept second-class treatment, to apologize for having strong convictions? As an out gay man, I have tasted the poison of discrimination, but thank God my faith has made me free and able to give back so that others don't have to suffer quite so much. As long as the abuse of trans children is encouraged by law, the church has a duty to demand justice. As long as there are immigrants who are used to being dehumanized as scapegoats of an intentionally broken system, the church has a duty to demand justice. As long as women are deprived of the same rights as men and deprived of equal pay, the church has a duty to demand justice. As long as there's exploitation of the planet God entrusted to our care, the church has a duty to demand justice. In the 1960s, Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail was aimed at the mainline white Protestant church, the moderates who kept delaying. It's just not time, we're just not ready yet, we'll get there, just why can't you be patient? 60 years later, I wonder, are Dr. King's words still timely? Now I ask you sincerely, who was freer? Dr. King in that jail cell, or the people who put him there? Who was really freer?